Strange creatures don't just lurk in the forests and dark places. Sometimes they stalk the open deserts, and they're far more bizarre and disturbing than the old Wendigo and Skinwalker. This story, titled The Mouth in the Desert from Quinn 33, tells of a strange discovery in the desert that haunts the narrator and his friends all summer, because what they found out there has also found them, and it's something spoken of in centuries-old texts. Some quick context. In the early 90s, I was at UNM, University of New Mexico, Albuquerque. I was a history major, which should tell you how seriously I was taking my future. I had a group of friends, maybe 6 or 7 of us, depending on the week, and we were the kind of college kids who thought we were outdoorsy because one of us owned a tent. We would load up on weekends, sometimes over breaks, driving out into the desert or up into the mountains, setting up camp somewhere, probably illegal, and we would drink until we couldn't see straight. We thought we were having adventures. Mostly we were just young and bored, and back then gas was cheap. The core of the group was me, my girlfriend Trisha, and my buddy Benjamin, aka Ben. I'd known him since 7th grade back in Tucson. A very friendly guy. He could walk up to a complete stranger at a party and just chat away. And people loved him for that. He had a big and loud personality. He would fight a vending machine if it shorted him a Coke. Trisha was quieter, but so damn smart. She wouldn't let you forget it. But I don't mean that in a mean way. She would just give you this look when you said something stupid, this little half smile, and you would just know. I loved her a lot. That's relevant later. The rest of the crew floated in and out. There was Danny, who was Ben's roommate. He always had some of the good stuff, if you know what I mean. Sheila was Trisha's friend from her intro psych class. She and Danny were dating or hooking up or something. It was never clear. Royce was an engineering kid, quiet too, but he had this massive old Chevy Suburban that we could all fit into, including our gear, so he was automatically invited everywhere. Then there was Kim, who came out with us a couple times early on, but then stopped. I think she started dating someone who had better weekend plans than us. But yeah, we weren't serious campers. I want to be clear about that. We didn't have GPS. I'm not sure who had GPS back in 1993. We had a road atlas, and if we were lucky, a gas station map Ben had stuffed in his backpack. We'd pick a spot based on someone's recommendation, usually Ben saying he'd heard about some place from a cousin or a guy in his dorm, or a guy he'd met at a party. Half the time, the spot would be nothing, just flat empty ground with some scrub brush. We'd drink there anyway and drive home Sunday, feeling sunburned and dehydrated, never sure if the time we'd spent there was meaningful. Now it's time to talk about what we found out there, near the Jornada del Muerto basin. I've gone almost 30 years without writing this down, and I think that was a mistake. This would have been in late March, maybe early April of '93, spring semester. Ben had been talking all week about a spot south of Socorro that somebody, I honestly don't remember who told him, said was incredible. Like Mars, he kept saying. Red dirt, flat for miles, mesas in the distance. The Jornada del Muerto is this long stretch of desert basin between the Rio Grande and the San Andres Mountains. The name means Route of the Dead Man in Spanish, which should have been our hint, but we were 20 years old, and that kind of stuff sounded cool, not like an omen. We piled into Royce's Suburban one Friday afternoon. All 7 of us. Me, Trisha, Ben, Danny, Sheila, Royce, and Kim. We had 2 tents, a cooler full of Keystone Light, a bag of ice that was already melting, and a bunch of canned food nobody was going to cook properly. Trisha had a paperback tucked into her jacket. Royce had the atlas open on the dash. Ben was in the back talking too loud about whatever, probably a girl or class he was failing. Danny was already rolling a joint. Kim told him to wait until we were at least out of Albuquerque. It was a good day. I remember the light when we got south of Belen, how the sky opened up and everything went gold and flat. Trisha was next to me. She put her hand on my leg, and I felt like I had everything figured out. Now I know I was young and stupid. We got off the highway around 5. Then we took a county road west, followed by a dirt road that was barely a road at all. Royce's Suburban handled it fine, but we were getting bounced around pretty good. The landscape was exactly as Ben promised. So empty it's hard to describe if you weren't there. Less sand dune and more hard-packed dirt, reddish-brown, with low scrub brush and the occasional juniper that looks like it died 10 years ago, but is technically still alive. There were mesas way out on the horizon, those flat-topped shapes that looked like they'd been cut with a knife. And absolutely nothing else. No houses, no fences, no power lines, nothing. We found a spot near a dry arroyo. A wash, basically, a creek bed with no creek in it, and we set up camp there. It was a decent spot. Flat ground for the tents, some rocks for a fire ring, enough dead brush around to get a fire going. We set up while there was still light out, and then we did what we always did. We sat around the fire and drank, talking crap. I remember Royce and Kim arguing about whether we'd come the right way. Danny and Sheila disappeared into one of the tents for a while and came back acting like we didn't know what they'd been doing. Ben did most of the talking, as usual. Trisha leaned against me with her book and read by firelight when the conversation got boring. It was a good night. What could go wrong at that age when you're with your friends and the stars look so bright it almost doesn't look real? I remember thinking that this was what life was about. This over and over until you grow old and die. Funny that I never really had a night like that again after. I woke up early the next morning, I think around 6:30, which was unusual for me during a camping trip. Trisha was still asleep in the tent. I crawled out and the air was cold. Desert mornings can be very, very cold. Folks don't realize that, and the sun was just barely coming up over the eastern mesa. Everything was still, quiet, and the light was this pale orange color. Ben was up. He was sitting on a rock near the dead fire, drinking water from a jug. He seemed to be lost in thought. He did that sometimes. For all his loudness, Ben had this other mode, where he would just sit and stare, and you could tell he was thinking about something that he did not want to talk about. Ever. I sat down next to him, and we didn't say much for a while. Eventually, he said he wanted to walk out toward the mesa, just to see what was out there. I said sure, sounds fun. We woke Trisha first. She would have been so pissed if we left without telling her. She put on her boots and jacket and came along with us. Everybody else was dead asleep. We walked east-ish. The terrain was flat with a gentle slope upward, and the ground was rocky. We were about 15 or 20 minutes from camp when Ben stopped and pointed. There we saw a deer up ahead, about 100 yards out. Something looked wrong immediately, but my brain took a while to catch up. The deer was on its side, kind of, its front legs stretched out in front of it. At first I thought it was dead, but then I saw one of its front hooves twitch, scraping at the dirt, and I realized it was alive, but only barely. "It looks stuck on something," Ben said. He started to walk faster. See a problem, walk towards it was the way of the Ben. So we followed him. As we got closer, the picture started to come together, and I was not liking what I was seeing. The deer's front half was on the ground, thin and heaving. You could see its ribs, and its back half was, well, I want to say inside something, but that's getting ahead of what I understood at the time. You see, at that moment, I thought the deer had gotten tangled in something. There was a shape behind the deer, a dark mass on the ground, and the deer's back legs went into it and did not come out. I thought it was a dead animal, like a cow carcass or something that had been rotting in the sun for too long. It was dark, mottled, with a leathery texture. It humped up from the ground maybe 2 feet high and was shaped like, well, I don't even know, like a collapsed bag of something. There was no true form to it. It just slumped there on the dirt. But then we saw the skull. On one end of the mass, partially resting against the ground, was a skull. White, smooth, and very messed up. Because it didn't look like a cow skull or a coyote skull. It looked human. The proportions were human. Forehead, eye sockets, cheekbones, but no lower jaw. The skull just sort of ended where the jaw should have been, and below it the dark mass began. The mouth wasn't on the skull. The mouth was the whole body, or the opening of it. That's where the deer's legs were going. I had no idea what I was looking at. My brain was just feeding me wrong answers. It's a dead, rotten cow. It's a pile of old, melted leather. It's trash someone dumped. The skull is a rock that looks like a skull, and so on. I was standing maybe 10 feet away from it, and I was still telling myself that what I was seeing was somehow something normal. Ben wasn't having the same problem, and if he was, he pushed past it faster than I did. He walked right up to the deer and grabbed on to both front legs. "Help me pull it out," he said. Trisha replied, "Ben." Just his name, just like that. A warning, but he didn't listen. I grabbed the deer's midsection. It was warm and trembling, and I could feel its heartbeat going fast under my hands. Together we pulled. The deer slid toward us maybe an inch, and then it stopped. There was resistance, not like it was stuck on a branch or wedged against something, but like it was being held onto. Something had a hold of it. Something was holding on from inside that dark opening. Ben adjusted his grip and pulled harder. He was a strong guy, but the deer didn't come toward us. It slid the other way, deeper in, about 2 inches. I heard a sound suddenly, like a boot being pulled out of thick mud, but in reverse, a sucking sound. The deer's back legs, which I couldn't see at all now, were just gone. Up to the haunches. The dark mass hadn't moved, though. The skull hadn't moved. Nothing had visibly changed on the thing at all. But the deer was going in. Ben let go and stepped back so quickly. The release of his hold on the deer nearly knocked me over. His face was white. I'd never seen Ben scared before, not once. He looked like a kid scared of his own shadow. "What the hell is that?" Trisha asked. But none of us had an answer. She was standing about 15 feet back, and she hadn't come any closer. Another reminder that she was much smarter than the both of us. We stood there. I'm not sure how long, maybe 30 or 40 seconds, but it felt much longer. The deer's front hooves were still scraping at the dirt, but slower now, weaker. The mass sat there on the ground. The skull caught the early sunlight, and it was so white it almost glowed. The eye sockets were dark and empty. They pointed at nothing. The whole thing was so still. Thinking about that part now gives me the heebie-jeebies. It was so clearly alive. It was swallowing a whole deer, but it looked as dead and inert as a pile of rocks, like it had been sitting in that spot for 100 years. Ben picked up a rock then, a good-sized one, and threw it at the mass. It hit with a dull thud, like throwing a rock at a heavy bag. The thing did not react, not a bit. The skull didn't move. The only thing that changed was the deer, which suddenly slid in another half-inch with that same slow, wet, sucking motion. "We need to go, now, please," Trisha said. We went. We turned around and walked back toward camp. We were so busy walking as quickly as we could that we didn't utter a word. I kept wanting to look back over my shoulder, and I did twice. The second time I could still see the deer's front legs moving against the sky. Just a little, the hooves catching the light. We left that deer there. That's something I've carried with me for a while. We just walked away from it. I know we couldn't have done anything. I realize that. I've told myself that 1,000 times. We could not have pulled it free, and we sure as heck weren't going to fight that thing with our bare hands. But we left a living animal to be slowly swallowed alive by something that shouldn't exist. And I hear the sound of it sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. That patient, sucking, wet noise. Back at camp, we told the others. Danny said it was probably a big snake, and Roy said maybe a sinkhole or some kind of natural formation the deer fell into. Kim just didn't want to talk about it, and she went to sit in the Suburban. Sheila asked if we were screwing around, but then saw our faces and didn't ask that again. We packed up. It was probably only 9 a.m., and we had planned to stay until Sunday, but nobody argued about leaving. The ride back was quiet. Ben stared out the window, and Danny put on the radio, and we listened to some country station that was coming in from Las Cruces, and nobody changed it, even though none of us liked country. Trisha held my hand, but she was somewhere else in her head. On Monday, we went back to class. It was like we'd all silently agreed to ignore what happened. The desert can be a weird place. Probably some sort of weird snake. Probably something normal we just couldn't see properly because we were hungover and the light was funny. That's what we told ourselves and each other. But I kept seeing that skull. Bleach white and smooth and so very human looking. And those dark, empty sockets that weren't looking at anything, weren't looking away from anything either. Below it, that dark opening, that deer being pulled in. I couldn't make sense of it, so I tried not to think about it. That worked for a while. Ben was the one who broke first. He called me from the phone in his dorm hall on a Tuesday night. It was late, around 11. I could hear somebody's music down the corridor on his end. He said he hadn't stopped thinking about it, specifically the skull. He said he'd been flipping through textbooks in the library, trying to find anything, any animal with a skull shaped like that. He couldn't find one. He'd looked at every large predator and scavenger in the Southwest, but nothing matched. I admitted I'd been thinking about it too. But I didn't tell that to Trisha. She and I had an unspoken agreement not to bring it up. And whenever I almost did, she changed the subject. Or she would leave the room or suddenly have homework to do. I don't think she was in denial. I think she just didn't see the point in talking about something that no one could explain. She was a practical girl. It was one of the things I loved about her, and one of the things that eventually made us not work. Ben said we should talk to somebody else, a professor, someone who knew about desert wildlife or ecology, and I knew who he meant before he said it. Dr. McBride. Dr. McBride taught geology. Technically, his title was something longer, like Desert Geomorphology and Arid Land Studies, but everyone just called him the geology guy. He was in his mid-40s, had a beard that was going gray, and wore the same rotation of 3 flannel shirts all semester. He left his office door open, and he didn't mind if you came in and sat down without an appointment. Half of the department thought he was a pushover. The students who actually took his classes thought he was the best teacher at UNM. He had done years of fieldwork in the Chihuahuan Desert before going into academia, and he talked about the landscape the way some people talk about a person they love, with much detail and much feeling. I'd taken his intro class the year before. Ben was currently in his advanced seminar that semester. We both liked him. He was one of those rare professors who treated undergrads like adults, which at 20, it felt like a big deal. We went to his office on a Thursday afternoon. McBride was at his desk behind a pile of rock samples and rolled up topographic maps, munching away at an apple and grading papers. He waved us in and we sat down. I remember not knowing how to start. How do you tell someone, especially a professor, that you found something impossible in the desert, without sounding like you were on drugs? Ben just went for it. He described what we'd seen. Deer, mass, skull, the way the deer slid deeper when we tried to pull it free. He was more detailed than I expected. He'd clearly been rehearsing this. I filled in pieces whenever he paused. McBride listened without interrupting, which was strange for him because he was a talker. But he sat there with his apple in his hand, no longer eating it. He looked at Ben, then at me, then back to Ben. When we finished, he didn't say anything for a few seconds. But then came the questions. He asked how big the mass was, what color exactly, like dark brown, black, or grayish. Did we notice a smell at all? What was the texture of the skull? Did it look like actual bone, or could it have been calcium deposit, calciumite something or other? How far from the arroyo? What direction was the skull facing relative to the body? He then asked if the skull had suture lines. I didn't know what that meant, and he explained. The little zigzag seams were the plates of a human skull fused together. I told him I didn't remember, but Ben said he didn't think so. He said the skull looked too smooth. McBride wrote something in the margin of the paper he'd been grading. Then he leaned back in his chair, and he said to us, "I'm not going to tell you guys this was a snake." We waited. He said it was possible we'd seen something badly decomposed, like a dead horse or cow, and that a deer had gotten physically stuck in the remains. Gut cavities can collapse, he said, and if the hide is still intact, it can form a kind of pocket. An animal can get a leg wedged in there. The skull could have been a separate object nearby that just looked connected. Ben said, yeah, okay, but then asked about the sucking. What about the resistance? What about the deer going deeper when we pulled? McBride didn't have an answer for that. He said that decomposition gases can create suction in an enclosed cavity. Then he asked us to show him on a map where we'd been. He had a big topographic map of southern New Mexico pinned to his wall. Ben and I pointed to the area as best we could, south of Socorro, west of the Rio Grande, somewhere in the flats before the San Andres Range. McBride found the general area and made a small pencil mark. I watched him do it. It felt like, to me, it meant something that he marked it like that, but I didn't know what. "The Jornada's a weird place," he said. "Big, empty, and almost nobody goes out there. White Sands is right next door, and the military has half of it fenced off for the missile range. There are parts of that basin that haven't had a human being walk through them in decades, maybe longer." He paused. "There's a lot out there that doesn't get cataloged, not because people are hiding things, but because nobody's around to see them." He told us it was probably a natural phenomenon that we didn't have the context to understand. He explained the desert does strange things to dead organic material. But I wondered, was he trying to convince himself or us? We bid him good day and left after that. Walking across the quad afterward, Ben said to me, he didn't think it was a snake either. "I know," I said. We didn't talk about it again for a while, but something had shifted. Telling McBride made it feel real again. We'd said it out loud to another adult, a scientist no less, and he hadn't laughed us away. In fact, he had marked a spot on his map. That was the first time after the event that I thought, maybe we actually saw something. We stayed away from that area for some time. Not because we were smart, but because it was the middle of the semester, and we had midterms. Plus, Trisha was working part-time at the student bookstore. Ben was also on academic probation for the second time. Life eased into being normal again. The thing in the desert was still in my head, though, but it had receded to the background, like a bad dream. You think about it less and less until whole days go by and you almost forget, but never completely. It was late May when Ben brought it up again. The semester was over then, and summer was starting. Half our group was leaving town. Royce went home to Colorado, and Kim was already gone. She had dropped out or transferred, I can't remember which. Sheila had a summer job in Santa Fe, and Danny was still around, still in his and Ben's apartment, but doing nothing in particular. Ben called me on a Saturday morning. He told me he wanted to go back. He was very direct about it, said he had been thinking about it the whole time, and he needed to see if the thing was still there. He needed to know if it had actually happened, or if he had been building it up in his head into something that it really wasn't. At first, I told him no. Tricia said absolutely not, which I expected from her. But Ben kept at it. Not aggressively, but more like he was pleading. He said if we went back and the spot was empty, if there was nothing there, he could finally let it go. He just needed to see. Surprisingly, Tricia changed her mind before I did. She said she'd rather go and see nothing than sit at home while Ben and I went alone and did something probably stupid. That was Tricia's whole thing. She didn't trust us to be careful without her, and she was right not to. So it was the four of us. Me, Tricia, Ben, and Danny. Danny decided to come. He didn't have anything else to do that weekend. I don't think he fully believed what we told him about the first trip anyway. He treated the whole thing like a road trip. He brought a 12-pack and a Frisbee. We took Ben's car this time, his old Honda Civic that had no business being on dirt roads, but miraculously made it anyway. It was hotter than the first trip. Summer was really setting in down there, and by mid-morning the air outside the car was heavy and dry. It tasted like dust. We camped in a different spot, a few miles north of where we'd been before, closer to a mesa that gave us some afternoon shade. Ben wanted to go straight to the original site, but Tricia talked him into setting up first. We put up one tent, got the cooler in the shade, and settled in. Danny cracked open a beer at noon. It felt almost normal. That afternoon, Ben and I hiked to the area where we'd found the deer. Tricia stayed at camp with Danny. She said she'd come if we found something, but she wasn't going to walk around in the heat looking for it. I think she was hoping that we wouldn't find anything. We found the spot, though. I'm sure of that because I recognized a particular rock formation near the arroyo, a cluster of sandstone that looked like a fist sticking out of the ground. The place where the deer had been, where the thing had been, was maybe 30 yards east of that formation. There was a stain on the ground, dark, nearly black, soaked into the dirt in an uneven patch about 4 feet across. It looked like someone had poured oil right there, except it wasn't shiny. It was matte, flat, and absorbed into the earth. I crouched and touched it. The dirt was hard and dry, same as everywhere else. Whatever had left that stain was long gone. There were no bones, no deer carcasses, no remains of any kind. Ben came up and stood over that stain for a long time. He kept looking out at the surrounding terrain, turning in a slow circle, scanning the scrub brush and the rocks and the empty flats. I knew what he was looking for, but he didn't find it. We walked back to camp, and I felt so relieved. That night was fine. We sat around a small fire and Danny told a long, rambling story about a girl he'd been talking to at the record store. Ben was not himself. He was quieter than usual. Tricia read a book, but eventually put it down and watched the fire. The desert around us was enormous. You could hear the fire popping, and beyond that, nothing. And I mean genuinely nothing. Imagine no wind or insects, and being too far from a populated road to hear any road noise. It was simple silence. I'm not sure what time it was when it happened. It was late, though. Danny had gone to the tent maybe an hour before, and the three of us were still sitting around the fire, which had burned down to a couple of embers and a few small flames. We were talking about normal stuff, like our summer plans, and whether Ben was going to retake organic chemistry. I was mid-sentence when Trisha stopped looking at me. She was facing me, sitting across the fire, and her eyes shifted to something behind my left shoulder. Her face didn't change much. She didn't gasp or scream or anything like that. She went completely still, like a prey animal. "Don't turn around too fast," she said. I turned around, but I listened to what she said. I didn't go fast, but it was too difficult to go slow either. Ben turned too. It was maybe 30 feet from us, right at the edge of where the firelight gave way to dark, low to the ground and flat. That same shapeless dark mass I remembered. The skull. It was facing us or facing our direction. It's hard to say something is facing you when it has no expression, eyes, or jaw. Only a smooth white dome with empty sockets. It was motionless, completely and perfectly still, like a rock. Like it had been there the entire time and we'd only just now noticed. For a second, I actually tried to tell myself it was a rock. My brain was doing that thing again, where it wanted any explanation besides the real one. But I knew. We all knew. I had been looking in that direction an hour ago, and there had been nothing there. None of us spoke. We sat there looking at it, and it sat there being looked at. The fire crackled. A piece of wood shifted in the coals. I could hear Ben breathing next to me, too fast. "It's the same thing," Ben said quietly. "I know," I replied. Ben reached for the flashlight he'd left on the ground by his feet, a big heavy mag light that could double as a weapon. He clicked it on and pointed it at the thing. The beam hit it, and I could see it clearly, better than the first time. The mass was dark brown, tending toward black, and the surface had that same leathery look, like dried-out hide. But it was wrinkled, folded in on itself, not following any known anatomy. But there were limbs. I could see them now, pale, the color of the skull, pressed flat against the ground and folded alongside the body. I counted what I thought were 4, but it was hard to tell where one ended and the mass began. They looked like arms, long, thin, and overly jointed arms. The fingers were splayed flat on the dirt. The skull sat on top of it all, or at the front, resting on what I guessed was a neck. Though the neck was so slack, it was basically just a hinge, letting the skull hang forward. The eye sockets caught the flashlight beam, and seemed much deeper than they should have been. And the bone, or whatever it was seamless. There were no suture lines like Ben had told McBride. It was smooth as something that had been carved and polished. It sat there, in the full beam of the flashlight completely exposed, and still did not react. It didn't care whatsoever that we could see it. "Go wake up Danny," Ben said to me. He didn't take the light off the thing. I carefully stood up. I didn't want to take my eyes off of it, but I turned and walked to the tent. I was about 5 steps away when Trisha said something. "It moved." I spun around. The thing was in the same place and position. I looked at Trisha. "When you turned around," she said, "I swear it moved forward a little." "How much?" I asked. "I don't know. A foot." Ben was still pointing the flashlight at it. "I saw it too, man," he said. "It was like the arms just kind of dragged it. The skull kind of flopped and then it stopped." I stared at it again. It was motionless, absolutely dead still. The skull hung forward at the same angle. The limbs were in the same position, flat on the ground. But Trisha and Ben were right. It was closer. I could tell because there was a small bush behind where it had been, and now that bush was further back, relative to the mass. It had moved. While I wasn't looking, in that half second it took me to turn toward the tent, it had covered about a foot of ground. And something about that, the specificity of it, that it had waited until I turned away, it hit me in a place deeper than fear. I felt sick. Not scared, not yet, but deeply physically wrong, like I'd swallowed something bad. I got Danny. He came out of the tent groggy and annoyed. I pointed, and I watched his face go through 4 stages of confusion before landing on terror. "What is that?" he said. "What the hell is that?" "Don't look away from it," Trisha said. We stood there, all 4 of us, watching it. Ben kept the flashlight on it. Nobody wanted to be the first to suggest what we were all thinking. So I said it. "We have to leave now, right now." We didn't pack our things. We didn't grab the cooler or the sleeping bags. Nothing. Trisha grabbed her jacket and her book because they were within arm's reach, and we walked steadily to the car. Ben walked backward the whole way, keeping his flashlight pointed behind us. I don't know if it moved again because I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know how much closer it had gotten, and how fast. Danny got in the passenger seat and locked the door, which in retrospect would have been funny if any of us had been in the mood. Ben got in the back and Trisha drove. She was the calmest, the one amongst us with the least shaky hands. She started the car and turned it around. We drove out in the dark, bumping over rocks and brush until we hit the dirt road, then the county road, and finally, the highway. At that point, we all laughed, a big, relieving laugh we shared together. None of this was funny, but I guess that's how our brains worked, a way of exhaling the fear we'd been building up. I sat in the back with Ben. At some point, I looked over at him, and he was sitting there with his hands in his lap, staring out at nothing, breathing through his nose. He looked like someone who had been in a car accident, caught between adrenaline and shutdown. I put my hand on his shoulder and he flinched. Then he put his hand on top of mine and squeezed it, and we stayed like that for a moment. We drove all the way back to Albuquerque without stopping. We went to see McBride the following Monday. The 3 of us, me, Ben, and Trisha. Danny didn't come because he hadn't spoken to any of us since Saturday night. When Ben called him on Sunday, Danny said he didn't want to talk about it, and he was not joking around. He said he'd appreciate if Ben stopped bringing it up. They were still roommates for the rest of summer, but Danny started spending most of his time at other people's apartments. McBride's door was open when we got there. He was at his desk with a coffee and a stack of journals. He looked up when we walked in, and I swear his expression changed instantly before a word was said. I think he knew we'd come back at some point. Ben told him what we'd found this time around, explaining the stain on the ground and how the thing showed up at our camp. He described how it would move when we looked away. Trisha filled in the details Ben was too keyed up to remember, like how close it had been and what the limbs looked like. I mostly just sat there. I was tired beyond sleep. McBride listened closely. He asked a few questions, but fewer than before. When we were done, he got up and closed his office door, which he had never done before while we were there. He sat back down and was lost in thought. Eventually, he said he'd been doing some reading since our last visit. He had talked to a colleague in the anthropology department, a woman who studied oral traditions of the Puebloan peoples in southern New Mexico. He'd also pulled up some old Spanish colonial accounts from the library archives. He was being careful about how he framed this, I could tell. He wasn't making any claims, he was just telling us what he'd found. There were references, he said, scattered and old and not well documented. The Piro people, who lived in the Jornada region before the Spanish came through, had stories about something in the basin. Nothing like the usual spirit animal or trickster figure, which would map cleanly onto the usual categories. His colleague had said the closest translation she could offer for the word they used was the mouth, or the patient thing. The stories weren't detailed, and they read more like warnings. Don't sleep in the open in certain parts of the basin. Don't go alone. If you see something that looks dead on the ground, do not approach it. The accounts were so old that McBride's colleague wasn't sure how much was genuine oral tradition and how much was Spanish reinterpretation. The Spanish accounts were even thinner. One expedition journal from the 1600s mentioned soldiers finding a horse that had been consumed from the rear by some creeping malady of the earth. McBride said the language was ambiguous. It could have been describing disease, a sinkhole, an animal attack, but the phrase he kept coming back to was, "a mouth in the ground." That had stuck with the Spanish diarist enough to write down. I asked McBride what he thought it was. He had no clue. He said there were organisms in the deep desert that science hadn't yet cataloged, and that the Jornada was one of the least studied landscapes in the continental US. He said absence of documentation wasn't the same as absence of existence. He said all of this in his professor voice, more measured and careful. Suddenly he leaned forward, and he dropped the professor voice. He looked at us and said, "Don't go back out there." Ben started to say something, and McBride cut him off. I mean it. Whatever you saw, it's not something you're equipped to deal with, and it's not something I'm equipped to explain. Stay out of the Jornada." He let that sit for a second. Then he leaned back and the professor voice came back, and he asked if we wanted some coffee. We stayed there for another 20 minutes and talked about other things. Classes, plans, and normal things. But when I stood up to leave, I glanced at the topographic map on his wall, the one he'd marked the first time we came in. There were more marks on it now, 5 or 6 pencil dots scattered across the basin area south of Socorro. I didn't ask about them, but I wish I had. I also wish I never saw them, because it meant McBride had been looking for something too, or had found other reference points, and the idea that this thing, or things like it, could be plotted on a map made my stomach twist up in knots. We left his office and walked out into the sun. It was a beautiful day. The campus was green and students were everywhere, and everything was normal and fine. "He's scared," Tricia said. She said it quietly, like she was thinking out loud. "He's likely just being cautious," I said. Ben was quiet. We walked to the parking lot and went our separate ways. I told myself I was going to listen to McBride. I would stay away from the Jornada, forgetting about the mouth in the ground, and I would get on with my life. I really, genuinely meant it. It was August when we went back. McBride told us to stay away. Tricia didn't want to go, and I didn't either. But Ben seemed obsessed. He needed to go, and I could not let him do that alone. Tricia couldn't let both of us go alone either. That was the logic. That was always the logic with us. We did stupid things together because doing them apart felt worse. And Ben had been preparing. That's what worried me. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. He had bought a camera, a real one, a 35mm SLR he'd found at a pawn shop. He had binoculars, extra flashlights, batteries, a Coleman lantern that could light up a 50-foot radius. He had been out to a hardware store and bought a spool of fishing line and a bag of empty tin cans. When I asked him what the cans were for, he said he was going to string them up around the campsite as a perimeter alarm. so that we would hear it coming. The fact he said it, and not something or anything, told me where his head was at. Danny, of course, was out. He'd made that clear weeks ago. So it was just the three of us. Me, Ben, and Trisha. We took Ben's Civic again. The drive down was quiet. Not the bad kind of quiet from the last trip, but like we all knew that we were doing something that we shouldn't be doing. Trisha sat in the back and looked out the window. She'd brought her book, but she didn't open it. We got to the area in the early afternoon. It was midsummer hot, over 100 degrees, hot enough to make the ground shimmer, and everything past a quarter mile turned into a blur. We set up camp in roughly the same spot as the second trip, near the mesa, and saying that it made me uncomfortable would be an understatement. Ben strung his fishing line between scrub bushes and rocks in a wide circle around the camp about 30 feet out, with cans knotted on every few yards. It looked ridiculous. It also made me feel a tiny bit better, which was its own kind of sad. The plan was to stay up all night. We'd watch for it. Ben wanted a photo. He said if he could get a photo, then at least it wouldn't just be a thing 3 college kids said they saw in the desert. It would be real, on film, and something he could show to McBride, or anyone else. I didn't tell him that I thought a photo wouldn't change anything, or that even if we got a perfect shot of that skull and that mass and those impossible limbs, people would say it was a hoax or a weird rock formation or a dead animal. I didn't say that, because I knew and he knew, and we were out there anyway already. We ate canned chili for dinner. We didn't drink any beer because Ben wanted us alert. That was a first. Trisha made coffee on the camp stove, and we sat in a triangle around the lantern with the fire going, the dark pressing in from all sides. The stars were out again, Milky Way like a smear of chalk across the middle of the sky. It was beautiful. Trisha put her hand in mine, and I held it. The hours went by. Ben swept the flashlight beam in a full circle every 10 minutes or so, methodically. The beam would travel across empty scrub and empty dirt and rocks. The fishing line would glint where it caught the light. There would be more scrub, then nothing. 10 more minutes, another sweep, nothing. I started to think and hope that it wouldn't show up. Maybe it was a territorial thing, and we were far enough from its spot that it didn't care. Perhaps it was seasonal, and it had moved on from here. I started to relax, and I remember thinking that Ben might actually get what he wanted from this trip, which wasn't a photo, but the absence of one. Proof that it wasn't following us, that it was just some animal, a weird desert thing, confined to one patch of the dirt in the Jornada. Then we could go home and slowly let it become a story we told at parties. It must have been past 1 a.m. when Ben did another sweep. The beam caught it. It wasn't at the perimeter or beyond it. It had made it inside, maybe 15 feet from where we sat, between the lantern and Ben's car. It was flat against the ground, pressed down like something that had been stepped on. The skull was angled slightly upward, about 10 or 15 degrees off the dirt, and it was pointed in our direction. The limbs were out, splayed and pressed flat. Those long, pale arms with too many bends in them arranged around the body like the legs of a dead spider. It had not tripped the cans. The fishing line on that side was still intact. I could see it running behind the thing, undisturbed. It was just there, inside our perimeter, still and silent, as if it had come from out of the ground. "It's bigger," Ben said. He was right. Or it had somehow spread out more. I couldn't tell. It covered more ground than I remembered. The mass was wider, flatter, and the limbs seemed longer. The skull was the same, though, always the same. That smooth white shape with the empty sockets and no jaw. I told Ben we had to go. I said it calmly. I said the car was behind it and to the right, and we could loop around and get to it without getting too close. But Ben didn't move. He stared at it, He had the camera around his neck, but he hadn't touched it yet. Then he took a step forward. "Ben!" Trisha called his name, just like the first time back with the deer, saying his name like a warning. He took another step. He was maybe 10 feet away from it now. He crouched low slowly, the flashlight in his left hand, pointed right at the skull. He was close enough to touch it if he reached out. Thankfully, he did not reach out. He just looked at it. "It's not bone," he said. "I don't think it's bone. It's too smooth." He moved the beam down from the skull to where the skull met the body, that dark transition where the white ended and the leathery mass began. "There's no jaw at all. The opening is underneath, like the skull is just sitting on top of the mouth." "Ben, please get up," Trisha said. And then he did it. He held his hand out toward the thing, not touching it, but hovering his hand a few inches over the surface of the mass near where the skull connected. He held it there for maybe 2 painful seconds. Then he pulled back. "It's warm," he said. He looked back at us, and his face was doing something I couldn't read. "It's really warm, like body temperature. It's alive under there." "It is alive, Ben. Get up. Come over here." He turned back to look at it. He was still crouched there, flashlight in hand, only 2 feet from that skull. While we were all watching, while all 3 of us had our eyes directly on it, the skull moved. It was so horribly slow. It tilted on its slack neck, maybe 3 or 4 degrees, tilting towards Ben. The movement was so slight that for a half-second I thought I'd imagined it. But I hadn't, because the angle of the eye sockets changed. They'd been pointed generally at our campsite. Now they were angled at Ben's face, and the dark opening underneath the skull, the place where the deer's legs had gone, widened just slightly, an inch, maybe 2. The edges of the mass pulled apart, and the opening got a little bigger, and I could see inside it for just a moment. It was dark and wet, and very, very deep. So deep it didn't make sense for something that was flat on the ground. Ben fell backward. His legs just went out from under him, and he landed on his back in the dirt, scrambling away on elbows. The flashlight went sideways and rolled, and the beam spun across the ground. For about 2 seconds, no one had a light on the thing. When I grabbed the mag light and pointed it back, the thing was in the same place and position. The skull had tilted back to where it had been before. The opening had closed. But Ben had felt the warmth, and we'd all seen the skull turn. We'd all seen that mouth open, and that was enough. It was more than enough. We ran back to the car and jumped in. Ben was in the back, panting, holding the camera he never used. Trisha started the engine and floored it, and we bounced across the desert floor in the dark. No headlights for the first few seconds because she forgot to turn them on. When the headlights came on, I looked back through the rear window, and I couldn't see anything behind us except the glow of our abandoned lantern, very small and getting smaller. The cans on the fishing line had not made a sound the entire night. When we hit the highway, Trisha said, "No more. That was the last time." I agreed. We told McBride about the encounter. When Ben got to the part about the warmth, about the skull tilting, McBride closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them and said he was going to recommend the area be flagged off for a geological survey through the university. It was clear that this was the only thing he could think to do. Truthfully, I don't know if the survey even happened. I don't know who he would have talked to about it, or what he would have said. That was the last real conversation I had with McBride about any of this. I saw him around campus a few times after that. He was always friendly, but he wouldn't bring it up, never provided updates. In the early 2000s, he retired. I tried to email him about 5 years ago, but the address bounced. I looked him up online and didn't find much. I figured he had died, or he'd found somewhere quiet to live. After that summer, Ben transferred to a school in Oregon. We stayed in touch and we're still in touch. He's in Portland now, with a wife and 2 kids. Trisha and I broke up the following spring, and the most I can say about that is that the skull thing encounters did not help our relationship. Now, I must warn you, the end of this story is going to be a bit anticlimactic, because that was the end of it. We've never heard anything about this or anything like it since then. But it feels good to finally get this story out there to someone who might listen. So that was one of the strangest sounding monsters I've ever read about on this show. Even now I'm struggling to properly visualize it. If there are any artists out there, send me a sketch on Twitter at Dark Prevails of what you think this thing looked like. And I promise I'll only have nightmares for a few weeks. Good night. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. If you can't wait for the next episode to come out, be sure to look up my other podcast, where I narrate people's true scary stories that are work-related. It's called Tales from the Break Room, and you can find it on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Thank you. Be sure to leave Unexplained Encounters a follow and rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts too. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.